Ladies and gentlemen, colleagues, we start again. I'm pleased to introduce the next speaker, who is Hilary Macartney. She's research associate and lecturer in Spanish art at the University of Glasgow. Her interests include the historiography and reception of Spanish art and the reproduction of art. And she worked already a lot about Sir William Sterling Maxwell in her doctoral thesis at the Courtauld Institute of Art in London. And some of her publications were dedicated to Sterling Maxwell. For instance, a chapter on the reproduction of Spanish art in Spanish art and Britain in Ireland. And a number of articles. The most recent is Faith in Facsimile with question mark, the invention of photography and the reproduction of Spanish art in Art in Translation 2015. And she has collaborated with colleagues at the Prado Museum, the National Media Museum in Bradford, and the Centro de Estudios Europa Hispanica in Madrid on a research project on the photographic illustrations for the annals. The resulting facsimile and critical edition of the Talbot-type illustrations to the annals of the artists of Spain will be published in the coming months and will be accompanied by the exhibition at the Prado. And Hilary is going to speak about In Search of a True Likeness, Sir William Sterling Maxwell and the Photography of Art. Thank you.
Thank you. Well, first of all, it really is a very great pleasure to be here today. Thank you very much for inviting me to speak. And especially because there's been this amazing synchronicity between the conception and planning of Photo Archives 5 and the project on the first photographically illustrated book on art. The volume of Talbot-type illustrations to William Sterling's Annals of the Artists of Spain of 1847 to 48 that I've been involved with, as Costanza was saying, for the past few years as a collaboration between the University of Glasgow, the Prado Museum in Madrid, the National Media Museum in Bradford, sadly, perhaps, soon to be no more, at least in its present form, and the Centro de Estudios Europa Hispanica in Madrid. That project brought me here to study the Getty's copy and related material exactly 3 years ago, just coming up to Oscar's time, I remember. And I met Tracy, who told me about her plans for a symposium. And the rest, as they say, is history. So, well, some of you, I'm sure, have perhaps heard of this volume, the Talbot-type Illustrations to the Annals of the Artists of Spain, as a limited edition volume of 66 illustrations photographed by William Henry Fox Talbot's assistant, Nicholas Henneman, in 1847 and produced to accompany William Sterling's 3 text volumes of the Annals of the Artists of Spain, which appeared in 1848. It's referred to in passing, generally, in the literature on photography of art, though in some cases the references can be a little backhanded or at least partly negative, which is understandable in order to stress that we're at the beginning of an important and historical new development, as if to emphasize that this is only the beginning, as it were. And of course, I totally agree with that. And Sterling himself, in his short preface, is very modest in his claims. He intends the volume only as an example to point to some of the possibilities, quote, to induce other abler contributors on the history of art to illustrate their works through the pencil of nature, i.e. through the calotype or Talbot-type photographic process. So part of what I'd like to do here today is to acknowledge and run with the idea of only a beginning, but also at the same time to try to contextualize it, to show something of what Stirling's purpose was and how the shortcomings actually help us to reflect on the relationship between the original and the copy, and on just how difficult and complex that relationship can be. There were only 50 copies. Often you'll see it referred to as consisting of just 25. So confusingly, there were 25 of two different sizes to accompany two different sizes of the text volumes, though the photographs themselves are always the same size. But probably few of you have actually seen a copy. So here it is. This is what it looks like within the limitations of current digital photography and screens, etc. And I should have put up a ruler with this slide. This is the larger size, which is just under 11.5 inches tall, i.e. the volume itself. Oh yes, and by the way, this doesn't actually refer to this one, but just while I remember, I have made a kind of tokenistic effort with the relative sizes of the originals, the reproductions, and the intermediaries in my slides. Anyway, so perhaps you can see here that even though Stirling hasn't combined, in this case, words and image on the page, what he is looking towards is photography as book illustration, rather than an album or portfolio of illustrations. And the recipients were friends and family and fellow scholars and 3 institutional libraries. As regards the lukewarm references to the volume in the modern literature, they tend to stress the fact that the volume contained reproductions of engravings of artworks rather than of the artworks themselves. And that is partly true in that about half of them that it applies to. But there is the implication then that engravings per se and seeking to find accurate ways of reproducing them is not a sufficiently worthy aim. Whereas, of course, in Stirling's time, or even back to Niepce in the early 19th century, one of the key drivers to the invention of photography is to find accurate ways of reproducing engravings, rather than constantly reproducing them manually with increasing inaccuracy. And indeed, there was a huge increase in printmaking to reproduce art in the 19th century, which was not by any means abated by the invention of photography, and rather to the contrary, as printing and photography went on to enjoy an even closer and more complex relationship through photomechanical reproductive techniques, as we know. But Stirling is also extremely interested in the history of engraving and etching and printmaking generally, and especially in how the invention of printing gave access to the exchange of ideas and images, including the transmission of ideas about art and artists. So through the annals, he focuses, although the annals focuses mainly on the history of painting, Stirling also included other arts and, as much as possible, about the history of printmaking in Spain, about which nothing or very little would have been known outside Spain at this date. The volume of Talbot-type illustrations, then, gave him the opportunity to add some important examples, such as this woodcut portrait of Juan de Iciar of 1550, which reproduces very well, I think you'll agree here, and it and a number of the other etchings and engravings contained in the volume continue to be regarded as key examples in the history of printmaking in Spain. One of the challenges for us on the project has been to understand what Stirling was seeking to reproduce, and for him, what of significance it represented in terms of the history of Spanish art. And one of his points in the annals is that within the history of printmaking, there were comparatively few native printmakers. And this had an impact on the critical fortunes of Spanish art and Spanish artists internationally, compared with, say, Italy and the Low Countries. Significantly, one of the Spanish painters who was an eminent printmaker was José de Ribera, who worked mainly in Naples in Spanish Italy. And he did reproduce his own painted compositions in etching, which contributed greatly to his fame. In many cases, however, the relationship between his painted and his graphic work is just that, a relationship, rather than direct reproduction. Such was the case of one of his later very outstanding etchings, that of Don Juan of Austria of 1648. It's also one of the rarest, with only a few known examples worldwide today. And again, I think that it reproduced beautifully in the Annals Talbotypes as a reproduction of an etching in its own right, as we decided, rather than as a reproduction of a related painting. The other great Spanish printmaker who is extremely well represented in the Annals Talbotypes is Goya. And this is perhaps all the more surprising, since Goya had died only relatively recently in 1828, and his major international reputation was only built up in the second half of the 19th century and had much to do with French artists. So Sterling's coverage of him in the Annals in general, and the Talbotype illustrations in particular, is quite extraordinary. There are 4 of Goya's early etchings from the 1770s after Velázquez's royal equestrian portraits of the 1630s, in addition to 3 from the Tauromaquia and 3 copy engravings in the text volumes. Sterling's entry on Goya continues and develops the idea of him as perhaps the sole, or certainly the most worthy inheritor of Velázquez's native Spanish genius, as opposed to the adopters of Italianizing or Frenchified style. The Goya etchings after Velázquez can in many ways be seen as epitomizing that relationship, and they also encapsulate a lot of the 18th century notion of the study of prints as the study of art. And certainly they were well received in this way at the time. And they also prompted Sterling to value them as capturing what he described as the essence of Velázquez's art, rather than a slavish imitation. And they're unlikely to be described as objective. So, why did they not reproduce paintings directly in the Annals Talbotypes, and what might they have achieved? Anthony Hamber noted that of the 66 Annals Talbotypes, not one is directly of an oil painting. Sterling himself wasn't yet a great collector of Spanish paintings, which he could have used for his experimental volume, and taking cameras into the growing number of public museums was still a few years ahead. But Anthony drew attention to the fact that although 2 Goya oil sketches were already owned by and photographed for Sterling, they weren't included in the volume in the end. Looking at the painting of boys playing at seesaw, alongside a selection of the untrimmed proofs that remained in Henneman's studio, we too might wonder why this image wasn't included in the volume if they could get results like the one on the left, immediately on the left of the painting. But one answer must then be that although a few good examples were possible, the remaining proofs seem to suggest that it would have been very difficult at the time to obtain 50 consistently satisfactory results. But we also need to think about Sterling's own priorities for the volume and how he saw photography as potentially contributing to access to and study of and dialogue on art, and he certainly included contributing to the creation of an overdue canon of Spanish art. The Boys Playing series are not major established works, perhaps compared with Goya's graphic work that could be argued to be more representative of that artist's work. as Anthony Hamber also pointed out, though Stirling's annals don't contain direct reproductions of paintings, there are several copies of paintings. To us, this appears perverse, but then it probably seems much more natural, since in the days before photography, so many people, when they visited museums, might buy or commission a copy as a souvenir or aide-memoire, or to train their mind to look and remember, they themselves would often make some sort of copy or sketch. And the inner ability to draw, William Henry Fox Talbot claimed, was the principal trigger for his invention of the negative-positive process of photography. In the Annals, Stirling called attention to the fact that some of the great series of paintings by Murillo had never been reproduced in engraving. He therefore made a plea to the then owners of some of the great works of Murillo in Britain, including the Duke of Sutherland, to have their works reproduced either in engraving or through the, quote, beautiful invention of Mr. Fox Talbot, which would multiply the image with still greater precision than the graver. Spanish art, as Stirling had discovered on his visits there earlier in the 1840s, was not nearly as well known as Italian art, and much less written about or reproduced. Added to that, the art which had largely remained in the churches and palaces for which it was commissioned was in many cases displaced and dispersed during the Peninsular War. And following on behind that came the dissolution of the monasteries, which likewise led to the loss of the original context that was so important in the case of series of works in particular. If reproductions of the major dispersed works were available, Stirling argued, some approximation at least of their relative merits could be made. It would also mean that at least a copy would be, quote, preserved for all time. And also it would enable, quote, humble lovers of art to enjoy the beauties and appreciate the genius of Murillo. Stirling himself was proud to contribute to this objective, this is the noun here, by commissioning reduced copies in oil by a Seville artist, José Roldán, of 4 other major works by Murillo, which had ended up in the museum in Seville after the dissolution, but had not yet been copied or reproduced in any way. These included the St. Thomas of Villanueva distributing alms to the poor, which Murillo himself was said to have particularly valued as an example of his work. We don't know, unfortunately, where the copies are. However, we did learn a lot about how they were photographed from some of the untrimmed proofs, like the one on the left, showing a system of cords to pull the canvas flat to avoid reflections during photography. And this was also many decades before the black and white film, that could translate tones and colors accurately, or at least according to systems that our eyes can process. We also discovered that in one of the copies of the volume, which had been given to the artist, scholar, and dealer José María Escacena in Seville, the photographs of the copies had been removed and replaced with direct photographs once these were available, perhaps in the 1850s or 1860s. This is one of those photographs on the right here, although without very close study, it probably is difficult to tell, but the principle's there. In fact, the photograph may even be by Escacena himself, because he was prompted to learn calotyping himself in London from Nicholas Henneman as a result of Stirling's Annals. The chemistry of the calotype process, which used light-sensitized paper and silver halides to create the image, was unfortunately inherently unstable, as we know, for reasons debated ever since, and which we also explored in our project. The images faded usually from the outside in once they were mounted in books, as here on the right. In terms of tones, we were also surprised by some of our discoveries and what they might mean in relation to the objectivity of the Talbotite medium here. Some of the illustrations are there because of what they represent, rather than the medium through which they are represented, as in the case of several engravings of the Escorial as the great palace monastery by the architects Toledo and Herrera for Philip II. When we compared the remaining tone in the best surviving examples, like the one on the right in the British Library, we found that it was considerably darker than the engraving photographed. In fact, it's now almost like the kind of opposite. So Thomas Malone, the chemist who worked in partnership with Nicholas Henneman at the time of the Annals Talbotypes, in recalling that period later, used terms like rich and velvety and mulberry to describe the ideal tone and texture of the prints. So perhaps they too were seeking to create their own aesthetic in the volume, in this case something more like a mezzotint, as well as to transmit the image through the medium of the Talbotype illustration. Or, in this case, did it indicate that the original tone and texture mattered less in this case than, say, in the case of the Ribera or the Goya? Although paintings weren't captured directly in the Annals Talbotypes, two little sculpture reliefs were. And in Spain, most sculpture was polychromed, and so we have both the problems of capturing the tones and the colors, in addition to the lights and the shadows of the relief. As in the case of the Goya's oil sketches, there are numerous examples among the proofs remaining in Henneman's studio and currently in Bradford, and they are a testament to the experimentation with lighting, especially to minimize the shadows cast by the frames. Here I've shown two examples of the range of tones achieved in the results, from almost a brick red on the left in the copy here at the Getty, to the much more brownish tones that we typically find in the British Library one. Talbot commented on the range of possible tones in both his books of photographs in 1844 to 46, The Pencil of Nature and Sun Pictures in Scotland, suggesting that there was no consensus on what was preferable. In Stirling's Annals, however, it may be that he and/or Henneman sought some sort of homogeneity across each copy as a whole. As we've seen, one of the reasons that Stirling was concerned that the great works of art that came to be recognized as such should be reproduced was in case they were lost or destroyed, as undoubtedly happened in Spain's upheavals in the 19th century. One of the casualties was Matteo Cereso's Supper at Emmaus. The position of the works in the volume tends to affect how well the photograph is preserved. Where this particular one falls is towards the end, and at either end of the book is where the fading is usually worse. And that means that we generally don't have good surviving examples of number 60, which is this one. The fading of the images also drew attention to the extent of retouching that had gone on, not just to cover inevitable little flaws like white spots caused by dust on the negatives, but also to reinforce the lines of the image in some but not all copies of the volume. And this is perhaps the most extreme example. So not all copies are the same in terms of the amount of retouching, but also how much more retouching might there be that we're not aware of. It's also quite fascinating here to ponder how the painting has been lost, but the engraving remains, and now the photograph has all but been lost and a drawing remains. Another copy Stirling commissioned for the illustrations was a little watercolor by a French copyist, Tessin, of a self-portrait by Pedro Arente that's now in the Prado, the oil painting original. The salt print has suffered the classic edge fade, as you can see, which perhaps to postmodernize might be considered quite fascinating in its own right and in its relationship to the both intermediary and original. In this instance, through comparison of the intermediary and the salt print, we came to suspect that there must have been some retouching at some stage, possibly on the negative. Unfortunately, they don't survive, or we haven't found them at any rate. And in fact, this is confirmed by one of Henneman's statements of account to Stirling, which mentions, that's on the right there, 1 Pedro Arente touched, £1 and a shilling. And to make things just a little more complicated, we can't know exactly what the intermediary by Tessin was exactly like when photographed, because it too was retouched in 1853, as Stirling noted on the mount. And this took place when the Louis Philippe collection was sold in London, and collectors had opportunities to view the works at much closer quarters than ever before. And this is just to show you another case of an extraordinary photographic challenge. Was this drawing of Christ on the Cross by Murillo in the collection of Richard Ford, which is undoubtedly one of the Seville painter's finest drawings, with much delicate work in chalk. Even today, it remains difficult to capture well. And here too, we suspect retouching to give more definition to the musculature. And again, an entry in the accounts might back this up, though it's a little more ambiguous in this case. So Stirling's very positive comments about the potential of Mr. Talbot's invention to preserve art for all time would have been made and printed in his book in 1847, though the whole process of printing was not finished and the book didn't appear until the middle of 1848, by which time he was clearly a lot less sure about the permanence of the images, to such an extent that he felt the need to issue a printed slip with the book, advising recipients that any faulty plates would be replaced by Henneman. Very few of these slips survive. Likewise, when he looked back at his experiment from the distance of 1872, he admitted that one whole impression had been discarded and replaced before the volume was issued, something we can now confirm from the accounts. And thus he claimed, this is this quote at the bottom there, that probably all that remained were a few pieces of tawny-coloured paper. Well, of course, we too now believe that through digital technology, we might have the means of preserving photography of art for all time, ? We decided as part of our project that the key output would be a so-called ideal facsimile through which we would try to give today's readers stroke viewers, something like the experience of handling the 19th century volume, its look and feel, by digitally restoring the images based on the best surviving examples of each plate. We reasoned that what would be the point of producing a new book in which we recreated the faded images, since that would hardly be comparable with the experience of opening the new book. But that said, how do we really know how rich or dark the images were at the time? And they vary. And in any case, we didn't want to produce something that was so authentic looking, at least, that it was prohibitively expensive. And so we're not having the original book cloth specially recreated, but something similar off the peg, as it were, since that's what Stirling did. And our images are not made with silver and light-sensitive paper and pasted into the book, but directly printed in ink onto the page. So in those senses, the facsimile is a false likeness from the start. But we feel the most that we can do is to try to imagine what Stirling might have done in our position, and we have no doubt that he would have embraced digital technology. And so we have sought consensus among the project group, and now we're documenting what we've done. And at the same time, the Prado Museum is reproducing their complete copy in the accompanying interpretive volume, and will seek to make it available online. So this slide was just really to give you an idea of how we went about it. though it has been a very long process through the photographic unit at the Prado. But on the left, you can see the kind of typical fading of this image, though we were lucky enough to find a much better example at Harvard. And then on the right is the actual watercolor by Richard Ford, because this is a contextual image depicting Murillo's house in Seville. And below is a screenshot of a first suggestion in Photoshop from Larry Schaff about the reconstruction. So these are the proofs as a preview, or as a museum without walls, or something similar. So this is where we've got to. So in conclusion then, we feel we should celebrate the annals Talbotypes for what they are, with all their limitations, and indeed because of their limitations, which help to open our eyes to some of the complexities of the reproduction of art at this time, and also as reminders of the vigilance required when we think we know what we're looking at. Thank you.
We have time for a couple of questions. It was so interesting to see this changing relationships and the coming of new technologies which produces a discussion about the old technology, and the new technology reacts and try to find solutions for old problems. The problem of colors is, of course, an important problem. The problem of canon that you addressed, a lot of stuff for a discussion. I open it to the floor. Kelly, here.
So I was just wondering, in the discussions about reproductions from paintings versus reproductions from the engravings, have you found much discussion by Henneman or by Maxwell about the preference for reproductions from one or the other, or is that not something that occurs? I mean, I've never read Henneman writing anything like that.
Well, I mean, it's not really Henneman's decision. I mean, all the decisions are really, you know, it's Sterling who's commissioning. But basically, you know, this is an experiment. This is what's available, and you know, if it had been a few years later, Sterling would have had, you know, an amazing collection. You know, the next year he buys, you know, an important Murillo, which he gets photographed. So it's not a lot that's available at the time, but I do think that for him, I mean, he does actually specifically write about those 4 copies of Murillos, and he is thinking about, it's not just, you know, sort of some interesting, what he describes as hasty sketches by Goya. It's that he wants to make sure that his audience, that he's making available important art by whatever means, and that includes through copies in oil paint. I mean, the oil paintings being copied in oil would be the first step anyway, before an engraving, or, you know, some kind of painting, maybe a watercolor, but preferably an oil painting. So, you know, even if it were an engraving, you know, that would take it at even a further remove. Which all seems very strange to us, but he does, you know, and he's aware of it, and you know, he writes about it, and you know, looks at the satisfactory or unsatisfactory results. But sometimes it's very strange because, you know, they're obviously very sensitive to these kinds of things. But we obviously sometimes don't see things in the same kind of way, because things that we think look awful, they seem to think are okay.
I wonder if this relates to the question about color earlier, in that in the period that photography comes along, most people would have only seen reproductions in black and white. The Illustrated London News, 1842, earlier. So, following on your last comment, was there possibly a preference, because people were inured to that kind of looking, to say nothing of the fact that it would have been easier and more efficient to reproduce the engraving, because there's no question of the color, the hues, the reproductions, and so it would be much crisper. And it conformed to the kind of images people saw in the illustrated weeklies.
Yeah.
So it's sort of putting yourself back into that 1840s.
Yeah. No. The engravings are the kind of standard, you know, but except that they might start with a painting in order to make the engraving. And in that case, you know, they did do them directly. But engravings are the standard. And therefore, you're looking for sometimes photographs that will then help you to be more accurate in the engravings that you're going to make. So yeah.
Yes, thank you very much. I would like to continue this point of the color. And I'm not a photographic historian, but an art historian, so in a general sense. And I think it's very important to show that long tradition of engraving, so that many art historians in the beginning of the academic art history in late 19th century did not even miss color, and more so certain tools and whole methods rely heavily on black and white. And for instance, Panofsky, with his iconography, wrote a letter in 1927 to the Bruckmann editors, who had sent him a whole collection of first-class color reproductions, and he wrote in a letter, "The better the color reproductions are, the worse for art history."
Yeah, I know.
And that refers to one point which you mentioned, that the essence, you mentioned that word, the essence of the print, or the I think the essence is thought to be in the formal structure of the disegno, and that is transferred even in the black and white photography.
I think that works. I think that's it's kind of complicated a little bit in Spanish art or Spanish art and Venetian art, but in Spanish art and particularly somebody like Velázquez and trying to reproduce his works. That's why Sterling is really singling out Goya and the kind of sensitivity of his reproductions, because they're feeling that it isn't about line and it isn't about disegno. It is much more about, you know, this more kind of ineffable quality and that's transmitted through the paint handling and the color. And it's actually trying to find a black and white medium that conveys those qualities as distinct from what's really the kind of standard Italian approach, or maybe the standard German art historical approach that's very much based on the idea of the primacy of line and form. So it is, yeah, it's just kind of made a little bit more complex in the case of Spanish art, and particularly reproduction of Velázquez, yeah.
Okay. But in fact, the debate on catching the essence of the work of art is interesting in both cases, and the detractors of photography at that time underlined that only the hand of a drawer is able to catch the essence, while photographing prints is the best option, because it combines both the hand of a drawer and the chemical mechanical process, as you showed very well. We have time for one more question, if there is one.
How extensive was the retouching? You mentioned that you didn't know what had been done, but that there was probably more going on.
Yeah, I mean,
as an artist there.
It's certain examples. I mean, there are lots of the 66 that don't appear in any of the copies that we've studied, that don't appear to have any retouching. But then there are certain copies, and also it does appear to have taken, I mean, this is something that clearly was taking place before they were issued. And certain copies do seem to have perhaps been perceived as being already rather weak before they were issued. And this is something that Talbot himself didn't really approve of retouching, but Henneman, I mean, is documented as employing, I think, a number of miniaturists that Talbot is criticizing him for. I mean, we have found lots of examples in pencil, in watercolor, in crayon, but I mean, this is why it's such a good term to refer to these early photographic books as incunabula, because each one really is different. And, you know, you just don't know what having seen one, you don't know what you're going to find in terms of retouching in the next one that you look at. But no, there are some that, you just know, well, we'll go to number 19 and see whether there's this huge retouch there. And sure enough, you'll usually find, but there's some copies that that retouch isn't there. But yeah, it's been it was quite a revelation, and it was actually one of the unexpected and very fascinating aspects of the study.
How many of the 50 copies did you get to see?
I've seen over half. Originally we thought that we would try and hunt down, absolutely the most that we could. But there was so much to do, so many other aspects of the project that we thought that, with over half we had seen, probably a fair sample. But we're also hoping that, with the publication, then I'm sure that, others will surface, sure enough.
Thank you once more, Hilary Macartney. And we go ahead with the program. I'm happy to introduce to you Melissa Ren, who is collection manager at the Art and Artifacts collection at the Harvard Business School. She has published widely on Life magazine. Title, including two recent essays, the famous Iwo flag raising, Iwo Jima Revisited in History of Photography 2015, and Within Their Walls, Life magazine's Illuminations in the Archives of American Art Journal 2014. She also has a chapter on Life's War Artist Program and coverage of architecture destruction during World War II in a volume about architecture and armed conflict, The Politics of Destruction, published in 2014. And a forthcoming essay by Melissa Ren is exploring life's reproduction of works of art and investment in color reproduction technology. The volume is titled Bright Modernity, Color, Commerce and Consumption in Global Perspective, and will appear in 2016 in a few months. She is currently completing her book on Life magazine and the wide-ranging role it played in the American art world, not only for art, but also for photography, and some of the issues she already covered in some of her articles. The problem of war, the problem of color will come back in her paper today with the title Documenting the War, Life magazine's coverage of World War II. Thank you.
Thank you for that introduction, and I'd like to begin by thanking the Getty Research Institute and the Huntington and Costanza Caraffa, Tracy Schuster, and Ann Blecksmith for the opportunity to speak today, and also to Sue Kang and Jennifer Watts. Thank you. When most people think of Life magazine and World War II, what likely comes to mind are images such as Robert Capa's D-Day photographs, or Alfred Eisenstadt's 1945 image of a nurse swooning in a sailor's arms. Yet Life magazine not only sought to capture the war on film, but also in paint. My talk today will survey Life's wartime commissions, exploring the motivations behind its war art program, as well as Life's views on the objectivity and limitations of photography, especially during war. Between 1941 and 1945, Life sent 29 artists all over the world to destinations from the Aleutians to Ascension Island to record and paint all aspects of war, from wartime preparations on the home front to island invasions, from combat action in the jungles to wounded and shell-shocked soldiers, from aerial raids to bombed-out buildings. Life's artist correspondents, not unlike their American forerunner Winslow Homer, who worked as a correspondent illustrator for Harper's Weekly during the Civil War, also painted soldiers both at play and at rest in between action, as seen in these watercolors and paintings by Life war artist Paul Sample, or these paintings of soldiers at work by Tom Lee. Covering the war was central to Life's mission. From its inaugural issue, Life positioned itself on the front lines. Indeed, Henry Luce promised in his 1936 prospectus that Life's readers would eyewitness great events. Early on, Life's editors and staff members recognized the need for both written and visual documentation of World War II in its pages, and from the beginning, they envisioned both photographic and painted images of the war as part of their weekly picture stories. And here I am showing you, for example, the varied coverage of the battles at St. Lo a few years later. The plans for a war art program began in 1939. On September 1st that year, the day when Hitler invaded Poland, Times circulation director Pierpont Prentice wrote a memo to Life managing editor John Shaw Billings, quote, "It is 80 years since the Civil War, but everybody still remembers the Civil War drawings in Harper's and Leslie's Weekly. It is 25 years since the World War, but everybody still remembers the war drawings in the Illustrated London Weeklies. And I sincerely hope that we are not so set in our devotion to the camera that we won't put a staff of first-class illustrators to work right away drawing the war news." The editors of Life certainly agreed. Not long after, in early 1941, Life commissioned 7 painters to depict national defense preparations, from machine gun practice in mess halls to shell factories and wartime construction. The resulting special defense issue featured, quote, "more pages in color than ever before printed in a single issue," and was one of Life's largest art-related features to date. That same year, just prior to the bombing of Pearl Harbor, Life editor Daniel Longwell wanted to cover events in the North Atlantic, And since he, quote, couldn't get a photographer into Argentia in Newfoundland to paint the USS Prairie, which at that time was doing almost secret convoy duty, Longwell persuaded the Navy to allow one of Life's artists, Tom Lee, aboard the destroyer. Lee became Life's first official war artist correspondent, and according to Longwell, that started the war artists. Thus, one reasoning for commissioning paintings during wartime stemmed from necessity. While Life, especially during the first years of World War II, could not send photographers to certain places due to wartime restrictions, they were able to send painters, who in the opinion of the editors could, quote, omit censorable material from their canvases and still produce an effective picture, which a photographer could not do. Navy Admiral Hepburn, who permitted artist Tom Lee to paint aboard his ship, also commented on the camera's limitations during wartime. Quote, the modern camera, in spite of its great scope and versatility, has definite limitations, particularly during night actions, in foul weather, or for battles which take place over wide expanses of sea and sky. These phases of warfare, however, may be depicted by an artist who not only can capture the dramatic intensity of an action and put it on canvas, but also, by proper use of his skill, can make scenes and activity more vivid and poignant, stressing and integrating essential elements and omitting unimportant details. For Life's editors, then, painting was an essential supplement to its photographic coverage. In their view, the combination of paintings, drawings, photographs, and text could not only better tell the whole story, it also distinguished Life's reportage from that of its peers and competitors. As Life editor Edward K. Thompson later reflected, quote, other publications didn't have the graphic approach which put our readers right at the ringside. You've heard scores of people say that Life outdid the newspapers in reporting the war. Life's success in sending artists to cover war did not go unnoticed. In 1942, Assistant Secretary of War John McCloy organized a War Department Art Advisory Committee, and 42 artists were hired as part of the Army Art Program. Upon hearing this news, Life editor Daniel Longwell wrote Henry Luce, expressing concern about what would happen to Life's war artists, fearing the next step would be the elimination of Life's opportunity to send artists to cover the war, as the government would now be employing artists for a similar task. His fears were short-lived, however, as was the government's war art program. While only $125,000 out of a $71.5 billion budget was slated for the art program, its funding was still challenged. Some congressmen supported the proposal, including A. Willis Robertson of Virginia, who argued, quote, we can take photographs of what happens in Europe, but it takes the vision and artistic skill of the artists to bring us the inspiration which only an artist can put down on canvas. Others, such as Congressman Joe Starnes of Alabama, dismissed the project as a, quote, piece of foolishness. In the end, the war program was cut, and in June 1943, when the $71 billion war bill was passed, 43 artists lost their positions. Life magazine came to the rescue. As soon as Daniel Longwell heard the news, he immediately went to see Assistant Secretary John McCloy and offered to employ all the civilian artists that had formerly been working for the War Department as part of Life's war art program. Out of 19 applicable civilians, 17 decided to join Life's ranks, and Life was once more in command of the largest war program in the United States. With renewed vigor, Life enlarged its program, sending artists to every corner of the world. Life allowed its war artists great latitude, asking only of them that they paint what they saw in the style they deemed most appropriate to the subject. George Biddle, who was initially in charge of the U.S. government's short-lived program but went on to paint for Life, outlined the artist's task in a memo he wrote in 1943. You are not sent out merely as newsgatherer, he said. You have been selected as outstanding American artists who will record the war in all its phases and its impact on you as artists and as human beings. What we insist on is the best work you are individually capable of and the most integrated picture of war in all its phases. Any subject is in order if as artists you feel it is part of the war. Battle scenes and front lines, battle landscapes, the wounded, the dying and the dead, prisoners of war, field hospitals and base hospitals, wrecked habitations and bombing scenes, character sketches of our own troops, of prisoners, of the natives of the country you visit, the nobility, courage, cowardice, cruelty, and boredom of war. Omit nothing, duplicate to your heart's content. You may be guided by Blake's mysticism, by Goya's cynicism and savagery, or by Delacroix's romanticism, by Damier's humanity and tenderness, or better still, follow your own inevitable star. Life's war artists sought to capture all aspects of war, and they rendered their varied experiences in a wide variety of styles and media, from quick pencil sketches and delicate watercolors to expressive and even cubist-style oil paintings, such as this by artist Ruben Kadish. Bernard Perlin covered events in Greece, where he went on 2 missions with a partisan unit, a patrol on the island of Samos and one on the Greek mainland, and recorded his experiences in a series of narrative figurative paintings that Life published in its February 26, 1945 issue. Life assigned Millard Sheets to report on India, where he chose to paint the starving poor and scenes of suffering civilians in stark, expressionistic images. David Friedenthal accompanied a Marine unit on a night attack on a Japanese-occupied island in the South Pacific that resulted in a powerful series of black and white drawings and color sketches depicting the serious assault in which 11 out of 16 boats were sunk and their occupants killed in 30 minutes. Later that year, Friedenthal was sent to Yugoslavia, where he was the first to depict the Russian army there at a time when neither Allied reporters nor photographers were allowed access to the Russian front. Thus, the war artists could record with their pencil, brush, or pen what the photographer could not capture with a camera due to environmental limitations, as well as security and military restrictions. Artists could also add in details that they would not have been able to photograph at the time because of safety issues or physical or visual obstructions. Paintings, unlike photographs, could also present the events of war in a continuous narrative within one picture. Whereas a photograph reproduces the appearance of one instant from one point of view, a painter could construct his image to show a progression of events within a single scene, or even to show multiple viewpoints simultaneously. Indeed, many of Life's war artists had prior professional training and knew well the pictorial conventions for both history and narrative paintings and landscape paintings, and utilized them as they rendered depictions of battles, destruction, and other events of war. These artists knew how to arrange the figures in the composition to relate best the important aspects of the story and to capture the emotional experience of the event. They regularly employed pictorial devices such as dramatic light sources and scale to denote importance in a given scene. They could also remove brush and other obstructions from their views in order to report clearly what happened, a feat quite difficult for the documentary photographer in the midst of action. Some of the artists even viewed their paintings as more accurate than the camera, especially when it came to recording the personal, subjective, and emotional experience of war. As Life war artist correspondent Fletcher Martin would argue when he was stationed in North Africa, quote, "The painter can make a more personal statement than the camera. His record can be stronger than the camera's because he can eliminate unnecessary detail and concentrate on the significant. Some of my work that digressed frankly from actuality met the approval of the fighting men themselves. They responded to it and said, 'I'd got the feel of the action.' That was the acid test." Also, unlike the photograph, which had to be made on the spot, a painting could variously be painted on site, be made after the fact, or from memory. This allowed artists to capture events that may have otherwise been impossible to do at the moment the action occurred. In fact, due to the dangerous environments in which many of the artists found themselves, most kept lengthy journals and sketchbooks to record both their thoughts and what they saw so they could paint from memory when on safer ground, often back in their studios. And for example, in the upper left is a sketch by the artist Tom Lee of the sinking of the Wasp, and you can see he's even made notes as to the color, the light of day, his feelings about that, witnessing that event that turned into this painting, which was reproduced in Life a few years later. Life even published examples of these sketchbooks in its pages, as seen in this spread from the October 9th, 1944 issue, which highlighted the trek of artists Aaron Bowrod and Byron Thomas in 1944 from England to France, 6 days after the Normandy invasion. When comparing such paintings and sketches with Robert Capa's powerful photographs of D-Day, it becomes clear how different media could offer varied views of the war. Life also employed painters to document the war in color due to the technical limitations of the camera at the time. even though by the 1920s and 30s, more compact and portable cameras had been developed with faster film, more powerful lenses, and accelerated shutter speeds, allowing photographers to better capture the war on film, the camera could not capture everything. Moreover, both before and during World War II, color photography was not technically advanced enough to shoot all aspects of war, and it took too long to process, as one editor at Life described, quote, "When the war broke out, those of us who got around the country at the various training camps realized color had to be used. One of the things to remember about the war artists was that Eastman had not yet developed fast color film, and the color film procedure was too slow to report the war in action." Thus, for Life's editors, paintings were seen as an essential supplement to its black and white photographic coverage. Not only could artists capture different aspects of war, they could do it in color. Take, for example, again, this painting by Tom Lee of the sinking of the Wasp, which was published in the April 5th, 1943 issue. When it was published, Time Vice President Alan Grover wrote Henry Luce about the painting, noting that it had, quote, "a distilled, considered truth which only artists can put into a picture." Grover continued, quote, "Some might say that the sky was not that particular shade of blue the day the Wasp went down, but Tom Lee has painted the very essence of that dreadful September afternoon and has given us an unforgettable image of an unforgettable moment in our history. It cannot be fairly said that a photograph would do the same thing." I should note, however, that though it was rare, Life did publish some color photographs during the war. One especially notable example was the 1944 article entitled "War Ravages Italy's Art, Allies Try to Save the Great Relics," which printed color photographs of the damaged monuments in Italy, from the bronze doors of Benevento to the cathedral in Capua, and showed the work of the monuments men. Clearly, there was a need and demand to see the war in color, and the article was one of Life's most popular that month. As Daniel Longwell described, quote, "Probably the single article in Life that caused the most talk and interest in the past month were the color pictures of ruined churches and their medieval art that appeared in the July 24th issue. The article came about as a result of our talk with the photographer George Silk before he took off for Italy. His research consisted in simply handing him the old Baedeker guide. The Life's photographers and artists at the front are continuing to do an enormously good job of reporting the war in Italy, Normandy, and in the Pacific. And for more on these images, both painted and photographic, of architectural destruction in the war, I see my essay in the volume that Costanza mentioned earlier. Life's ability to print photographs like these, as well as the wartime paintings in color, was due to its deep investment early on in cutting-edge technology in order to reproduce images, especially works of art, in color on a weekly basis. Life's editors considered the coverage of art as central to the magazine's mission, as well as the foundation of every issue. Indeed, returning to that prospectus for Life from 1936, Luce intended readers not only to see life and see the world, but also to see man's work, his paintings, towers, and discoveries, and he wanted to see that art in color. Life's ability to print color reproductions of works of art for a mass media magazine was made possible by key advances in printing processes invented in 1934 by R. Donnelly and Sons, the Chicago-based firm that also printed Time magazine. By combining a rotary press with smaller printing cylinders, building a gas heater right into the printing press, and developing a heat set process for instantly drying ink, Donnelly was able to increase production from 6,000 to 15,000 impressions an hour, thereby creating a quick, efficient, and cost-saving four-color printing process. Through this process, Donnelly could print both sides of coated papers simultaneously and therefore print large quantities of mass-produced color images in a periodical format at a remarkably low cost. Long before the war began, Life had been printing color reproductions of art from the work of homegrown American regionalists, and this is actually the inaugural issue of Life, which had a color spread in its very first issue, to color photographs of the Sistine Chapel. Life even explained the revolutionary color printing process that made such colorful spreads possible in a special Speaking of Pictures article entitled, "How a Four-Color Letterpress Page is Printed." On the first page of the article at left, Life illustrated in black and white the mechanics of the color printing press, numbering the various parts of the press and explaining the printing process step by step. The caption below the diagram touted the new technology's incredible productivity. Quote, "This press prints 3,200 to 4,000 color sheets with as many as 18 Life pages on one side of the sheet in an hour." On the opposite page, Life printed the 4 color swatches used in standard letterpress printing and then showed how an image was printed on plates from yellow to black, concluding with an example of a complete color job at the lower right. With the technology well in place by the start of the war, Life was easily able to print color reproductions of paintings by its artist correspondents alongside its black and white photographic coverage of the war. Life also produced 2 special war art issues. The first, published for the Christmas 1943 special issue, featured Fletcher Martin's painting of a nurse tending to a wounded soldier with North African ruins in the distance on the cover. Inside the issue, Life printed a 32-page color portfolio of war paintings by 6 of the artists with a commentary by John Hersey. 2 years later, Life produced another 24-page full-color article highlighting the range of work done by its war artists for its April 30th, 1945 issue. Its cover featured war correspondent Aaron Borod sitting amidst a pile of rubble with his sketchbook on his lap. While at first glance, one might assume that this photograph was taken amongst the ruins of war. As the editors note in the inside caption, the photograph was actually shot by Myron Davis in front of a building that was being torn down in Chicago, long after Borod had returned from Europe. Indeed, as Life's editors well knew, photographs, like any other picture, could be constructed. Life's reputation in the field of photojournalism has led many to equate the term picture magazine with black and white documentary photographs and photo essays. But Life's wartime commissions of paintings complicate these assumptions. A closer look at Life throughout its 36 years of publication reveals that Life's editors conceived of the picture magazine much more broadly than has previously been recognized. Life's premise from the outset was that all things visual were pictures. Indeed, Life's editors promised to show its readers the world in pictures, not just in photographs, and Life's war art program, and larger art program for that matter, was a central part of the magazine. As Life editor Daniel Longwell clearly stated, quote, "May I put the place of art in Life as simply as I can. Pictures and art are the same thing. Let us not get into aesthetics or semantics." In just 5 years, Life's artist war correspondents produced over 1,000 paintings, drawings, and watercolors, hundreds of which were reproduced in Life both during and after the war. Up to mid-1944, Life had printed approximately 160 reproductions of the 678 oils, watercolors, and sketches, and a total of 467 had been reproduced in Life by May 1946. The collection of war art remained at Life until 1960, when, during the week of the 19th anniversary of Pearl Harbor, 1,050 works in this collection were presented to the Department of Defense by Editor-in-Chief Henry Luce in a ceremony at the Pentagon. Life's wartime commissions of paintings, coupled with its photographic coverage of the war, provides a rich and diverse documentation of the American experience during World War II. As one editor later recollected, quote, "Although we covered the war with our camera better than any other illustrated magazine had ever covered the war, it was our painters who added the extra 10% that made the show truly notable." Indeed, Life magazine, with its paintings, photographs, reproductions, articles, and of course, the magazine itself as an object, provide an incredible archive of the war. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Melissa, for this paper, once again, about the essence and capturing the essence through photography or through painting. I was struck by the fact that many of the paintings were not realistic at all. So the thing was not to reproduce more realistically with a painting the events of the war, but it is just another program, and you showed that it goes parallel to the photographic documentation. We have time for 1 or 2 questions. Casey?
And I'm just curious about the political context for some of these decisions that were made for the illustration, you know, sketch artists versus the photographer in the field. Did the Pentagon or did the government ever work with Luce or other people at the magazine to express a preference? I know you mentioned at the beginning that there were some concerns about security with documentary photographers in the field, but I wondered if you could speak to maybe some of the other collaborations, whether they were overt or covert, between the two.
Yeah, that's an excellent question. Thank you, Casey. Well, they could definitely get away with more in a painting than they could with a photograph. That's clear, especially with the very famous photograph of 3 Americans dead on the beach at Buna. That was the first. Life had to fight very hard with the Office of War Information to be able to publish that photograph, for example. And actually when they did, which is also going back to this issue of text and image, people often see that image by itself, but if you actually look at the spread in Life, they wrote a full-page editorial kind of justifying and questioning the legitimacy of publishing that image to kind of prepare the American people before they even saw that, what was at the time an extremely shocking photo. So they were very well versed in the issues of censorship in the government. One of the things, there was a slide I showed of a sketch that Tom Lee did of a gunner in a plane, which was connected to this story they did on the Hornet. And you might have noticed in the sketch that it has a stamp. Those were they all went through government clearance. And actually the sketches, and if you look at the sketchbooks of many of these artists, they often have stamps on them. So they were reviewed, but then often published, and again, for the same reasons that the government saw them as kind of personal works and experiences of the war. They did, however, there are examples though, even with Tom Lee, of certain works not being allowed to be published because they might have given away too much. And there's a great exhibition up right now in Fredericksburg that will be traveling to New Orleans to the World War II Museum, which is on Tom Lee and his work during World War II. And in that exhibition, they have an incredible sketch where he actually showed too much of the radio lines, and they had to remove it, and there's actually notes. So that did happen to the war artists to the same, I mean, maybe not always to the same degree as some photographs that came in, but they definitely had to go through clearance. In terms of collaboration, Life's program was separate from any government program. It was completely privately funded corporate patronage of war art material. And that is really important because there were the other programs, but they were definitely doing their own thing and sending their own artist correspondence the same way they sent their own photographers and journalists to the various fronts.
I really want to commend you for a great talk that reintroduces us to this period of life and also of American culture as being one of transition between that combines many different kinds of graphic representations. I wonder if you've gone ahead to the Korean War to see if at Life there's also discussion about, do we want to again employ non-photographic artists to depict this? And so I would just like to hear, or is this really a 30s into 40s transitional period?
Yeah, oh, what a great question. Yeah, my larger project. Yeah. This is a 30s and 40s project. There's 2 really fascinating aspects about this program. One, it's also coming off the heels of the WPA. So there's this tradition of these programs commissioning artists to document and paint for these programs. And many of the artists who actually worked on Life's program had also had previous experience working for the WPA. So that's one aspect. In terms of the Korean War, what's really fascinating is that by that time, color photography actually had caught up, and Life didn't need necessarily to send the artists in the same to cover. That doesn't mean there wasn't artistic coverage. There are, and continue to be actually up to this day, military programs and artists working, documenting the war, but Life never did a program anywhere near close to the scale that it did during World War II. And then by the time of Vietnam, actually, they really moved to color photography. And what's fascinating about that is, again, they're kind of, they're in dialogue always with the changing technology, and they're really competing with television. And then actually television will be the demise of Life in 1972. So it's always about technology and what they're able to do versus what the camera or other forms of technology and media can do.
Do you think the public's preference for photographs changed? I mean, do you think that by 1950, by the Korean War, they preferred photographs to paintings to tell them about war? Does that make sense?
I don't know. I think that's a very complicated question in terms of the reception of these issues. I think that I think during the war, people liked the variety of coverage, and different readers responded differently to black and white photographs, and different readers responded differently to color photographs, and different readers responded differently to paintings reproduced. In fact, this painting in the lower right by Tom Lee, along with the other one I showed at the beginning, which showed a soldier whose arm had basically been blown off and was in shreds. Those are two of the most controversial images that were published throughout the entire war, and Life received thousands of letters to the editor about those images, thinking, how could you possibly show something so gruesome? And so people were actually more affected by the paintings than they were by the photographs. I think by the 60s, by the 50s, 60s, and 70s, people were probably very used to looking at photographs in Life, but my larger project on Life magazine is also about the fact that they continued to write on art and reproduce art in color all during that period. So people really were looking at the magazine with all its types of pictures, snapshots, maps, reproductions of all kinds. So I can't necessarily say there was a preference for one type of image over another, but you know, they were always looking for the best image. I should say that too. They were great editors. They knew what a good image was, and they knew when to publish it. And so if they had a great image, they published it.
And there was no debate about the truth of the painted images.
Oh.
Because one could say they are just, it is another rhetoric of the truthfulness of pictures. One could say opposed to the rhetoric of the photographic objectivity. One could say, how can we know that these pictures reproduce the war and not something that the artists just imagined or censored?
Yeah. Yeah, no, that's a really... yeah.
Was there a debate on this?
Oh, definitely, definitely. There's much more I could say about that whole debate, and the editors were also extremely conscious about this issue of truth and true reporting, and Life was very committed to publishing the truth in their, it's qualified, but publishing the truth in the magazine. And for example, too, with the famous Iwo Jima photo by Rosenthal, I've written an article about this, so I won't go on it too much at length, but the editors, when they saw that photo, thought it was staged. They did not think it was real, because it didn't look like any of the other photographs that had come out and come across their desks at the time. So even when it came to photography, they often expressed doubt or questioned authenticity of certain images, and they knew that images could be constructed. So I think that they were treating these paintings as another kind of, another way to represent the war, but certainly didn't necessarily think that photographs were more accurate or true than any other type of image.
This is also very interesting.
Yeah.
Melissa, thank you. Were any women involved? Were any women involved in this effort?
Yes, there were.
Because your list is all men and all the examples are men. And
Well, yes, except for two at the very beginning, actually. So
Okay.
there were two women that worked for their program, Edna Reindell and Gladys Rockmore Davis, and she was the wife of a male painter who also went to paint. Gladys Rockmore Davis was stationed in Paris, and she actually painted the experience of Paris during the war, and some really powerful paintings that were reproduced in life. And Edna Reindell painted women on the home front, and actually those two early images of women working as welders are her paintings of that. So they did employ two women, which is pretty remarkable for those women at the time to be a part of the program, but it was predominantly men.
Is there an index or catalog
Of the war art? Yes and no. There's not like, I can't necessarily point you to a published reference, but all of the paintings are in the U.S. Army Center for Military History collection, and they all are still together as a unit, and I could help you with a list of those, and you could probably get a full, complete list from that center as well.
Thank you for a very good talk. I'm curious about the propaganda element. I mean, what I'm seeing here on the screen is really a particular narrative that is about, a patriotic narrative about American heroes, more or less. Especially if you look at the cover on top. I mean, it gives you the impression that it is the Americans who entered Berlin, and I'm not sure if that's staged or not. There's a major rewriting of history, at least, somehow. So I wonder if you took that into account. Not to mention that it brings to mind the 2003 invasion of Iraq, when we had the statue of Saddam being toppled down, represented in images as a mass movement. Later on, we find from the footage of Al Jazeera that it was really like around 20 American soldiers and maybe 10 Iraqis present at the time. So, the question of objectivity and propaganda is something I'm curious about.
Yeah.
Thanks.
And that's another great question, and certainly there's a lot to be said about Life magazine, both through the war and throughout its entire 36 years of publication with their message. They definitely had a very clear editorial point of view. Certainly during the war, I think the other thing to remember too is this is the American perception of the war. This is not everyone's view of what's going on. And in fact, in my essay on architectural destruction, I discussed the fact that Monte Cassino, for example, which was Allied bombing, when they published that initially in Life, they presented it very differently than the way they presented it later, and I chronicled the different changing ways they presented that in terms of becoming slowly more pro-American, and then eventually Americans as coming in as kind of the saviors of antiquities and through programs like the Monuments Men. So that's actually a shift within a very short period of time during the war with how they covered those kind of actions. And also, there were war artists that worked for other countries, and there were images of Monte Cassino from the German point of view, and one particular painting that I remember, which is also in the US military collection, is a painting by a German artist who painted it as a fort, as if you were from the inside, defending yourself against the Allies attacking you. So there's definitely, first of all, multiple points of view, and again, here I'm again only showing you the American one. In terms of, these were, I kind of tried to pick some iconic covers here from the war, but certainly each photo here has its own complicated history in terms of who took it, why it made the cover, how it was read, what it was meant to say, and reflect especially at different points during the war, and that was also always shifting. The coverage of the Pacific, that's a whole nother talk, but the coverage of the Pacific changed dramatically throughout the war. So just even looking at one region and how they covered it both in photography and in paint shifted. Yeah.
Just one last question to Melissa Ren, and then we start panel discussion. And
I guess
I guess this is a segue into both, but I think after listening to Joan about the 19th century and looking at life, I'm looking at what seems to be very clearly a post-cinematic illustration technique. The color artwork they look almost like storyboards to me. And life was, in a sense, buy it and take it home cinema experience. You turned the pages, you read the captions, and there was a time-based experience, which may seem, obvious, but and certainly in the 19th century there was a time-based experience as well, with the way that prints would be positioned in relationship to text and to each other. But I think, especially with respect to these life images, you have to keep in mind, I think, Disney. Some of the ways in which animation played a part in influencing the static representations. Just wondered if you had thought about that in your work.
No, thank you. That is a really interesting frame with which to look at the painted representations in particular. Something I could definitely give much more thought to. I should say that they did sometimes lay out the black and white photographic spreads a lot more like in a filmic kind of quality. Not so much so with the paintings. The paintings actually were generally reproduced full page, or maybe 2 on a page, like you see here. So there is a little bit difference in the way that they're even publishing the color painted images versus the photographs during war, and that's something I could give some more thought to too in light of film and animation. So thank you.
So now I would like to thank you once more, Melissa Ren. And I invite all the 3 speakers of the session to join me for a short panel discussion. So we had a great first session with some fil rouge, the roots of the paradigm of objectivity, and all of you showed how the paradigm of the objectivity of photography was rooted also in the 20th century, and nowadays the art to the way to use digital media also has to deal with this problem. One other main point was the essence, the ability of photography to catch the essence of an event, work of art, the war, and so on. The relationship between different technologies, reproduction and imaging technology, photography and painting, but also photography and printing media, and of course, especially the paper of Melissa Ren underlined that the paradigm of objectivity is always connected with political implications and very often also with propaganda. So I would like to open the floor right now for a broader discussion, not only to the single speakers, but it is also possible to ask more questions, but also general questions are welcome. So we have a first one.
Thank you for pointing out the value of the object with the Life magazine. I'm curious about what you think about the devolution of sort of the distinction between whether something's disposable or collectible, and how photography is going to work through that concept in the digital phase, when something is available by the millions rather than by the tens of thousands or a print run.
Sure. I mean, I should say too that when I was working on my dissertation on life, I had a complete run of Life magazine in my attic, and I looked through every issue, flipping each page, and that actually very much informed how I thought about it. So it was very much about the whole run, first of all, as an archive, but second of all, each individual magazine as that object, as an object in itself. In terms of digitizing, I mean, Google Books has digitized Life. I think it's a very different experience than holding it in your hand. I think also the scale, the size of the magazine itself is quite important in terms of how you apprehend those images and photos. And then another thing too, if you just look at Life magazine, often these really powerful paintings were juxtaposed with funny advertisements and how to clean your kitchen and all other kinds of topics that had nothing to do with the images. So it's also understanding those images in the context of the magazine, the larger magazine itself, and how that might inform how you read the images. So as an object, they're really fascinating, and I think that I'm glad it's been digitized, but I think you also get a lot out of looking at the original, and I highly recommend it. In terms of the collectability, I can't really speak to that, but I know that they are collected. How did you get your full run of the magazine? Oh, I was fortunate enough to get a set of a large amount of them from a friend of ours, and then I collected the remaining ones myself. eBay, other ways. You can find them at bookstores. They're around.
I think there are two issues that relate to archives. One is the concern that archivists have. I mean, I left the archives when we started collecting born digital photographs because I said, if I can't see it, I don't want to be in charge of collecting it. And the concern is that the person creating the image has far greater control now than ever before on destroying the image or destroying the electronic record. And so as an antidote to that, there is a multi-million-dollar project out of the University of British Columbia, which is in fact related to the US State Department or the military, called Inter Pares. And they are going back to a European model that is based on sort of how the important stuff somehow naturally rises to the surface and gets saved because of the information overload. So, I mean, there is this paradigm of objectivity to me that lurks in this notion that the truthful stuff, the important stuff, is going to somehow get saved because of an algorithm, which of course an algorithm, then nobody thinks about the fact that somebody wrote the algorithm. I mean, the algorithm now is out on its own doing what it needs to, gobbling up documents for preservation. So I think your question's a really good one that digital records archivists, I think, are struggling with, or at least I hope they're struggling with. And one of the criticisms certainly coming out of parts of the Canadian archival community is of this notion that we go back to a European model and that the photograph or the documentary emanation somehow can be selected automatically. And Captain Paul might be able to, Paul Conway may be able to say more about that later or over break, but.
Well, in our case, we did think a lot about what were the most appropriate outputs from our project to study a book that is often where it can be found, its access is often restricted because it's considered so fragile. For example, the copy in the British Library that I've shown in quite a few of the slides, which is one of the best surviving copies, I think, they don't generally make it available to readers now, unless you're kind of making a special case why you need to see it. And so we did consider, making the book as accessible as possible, the volume as accessible as possible digitally online. But we did feel, I mean, the object is so important for people like Sterling Maxwell. I mean, you know, it didn't really explain, you know, his kind of context, but, you know, he's a major collector. He's a major bibliophile as well as a collector of art. And he's very much involved himself in continuing both the traditional arts of the book, but how to take those forward and adapt them to new technology. So we did feel that creating a physical object was an absolute key thing, and also for the modern public to, you know, try and imagine yourself there. You know, what was it like in the 1840s, you know, with one of the first books that was illustrated with photographs, and, you know, how did that look and feel, and what was that experience like? But having said that, I mean, yeah, I mean, there are a lot more grants out there still for digitization projects, you know, with the idea that through digitization and putting things online, that is how we're going to preserve things for the future, or to make things more widely accessible.
But what is not said in many cases is that digitization projects are always processes of selection, and selection is a process that occurs in an archive. If it is not said when you see, very often when you see a new website, an archive, a museum digitizing its own objects, that this is just a selection, and the not digitized material tends to disappear. I mean, there is a positive aspect to have more access in a democratic sense for the wider public, but there is also a problem of what remains hidden and in some cases disposed, as you know. We had a question there, and then here.
Hi, my question is on crediting, captioning, intellectual property. It seemed as though the life artists, their names were foregrounded and referenced in the articles that accompanied the images. Did presumably the magazine retained the rights to those images? And for the Maxwell project, the references seem to be to the painters rather than to the reproductive printmakers. Was Henneman mentioned at all? I'm just curious about to what degree these were presented as objects with or without makers.
In my case, because the book, the whole volume is by Nicholas Henneman, so you know, and that's explained by Sterling himself. Credits him in his preface, and actually William Henry Fox Talbot as well. And that's kind of understood throughout the volume. And so from because it's his project, it's Sterling's project, and his project is to illustrate Spanish art, that becomes what is emphasized, having got over the acknowledgement to the photographers. But he is somebody, I would say that he is one of the first who does consider this, because later on in the 1870s, with once photomechanical processes are available, he does go back to producing a book, a privately printed book, where he selects the various the burgeoning photomechanical techniques, and explores how well or otherwise they suit the reproduction of engraved portraits. And in that case, he's kind of showcasing around really the British Isles, the different practitioners and the different techniques. And he is very careful to note who the practitioners are and what the particular technique is, in a way that we as art historians have generally, I have to say, not been sufficiently aware of, I think, or we haven't highlighted these things enough in our study and in the traditional credit lines that we give in art books, in history of art books. We don't take that into consideration enough.
It looked as though he was cropping out the kind of traditional printmaking identifications, feckit, sculpit, and those were removed in the photographic reproductions. He wasn't.
They are, yes, and that was quite interesting as well. In the because we've got so many of the proofs that weren't bound up from Henneman's studio, we can see that they did actually photograph the whole of the prints. And we can see that when they get trimmed, they trim off all the information. But then Sterling does have a list of contents. So he feels that he is taking care of all of that information. And he does generally present the information that is given, or he comments on the information that is given in those captions.
Well, it occurs to me that it's not dissimilar to what we continue to do when we photograph for reproduction purposes a painting outside the frame, because the frame was an integral part of the painting. We change the frames and don't think about how the texture of the frame, the size of the frame, the intricacy of the frame had something to do with the meaning that was communicated and the space in which the painting originally was hanging. And we also crop out that kind of information when we digitize images, doesn't matter what kind, and put them online, take out the caption information, do not digitize the back of stereo views that have all that information. So there are broader manifestations of a similar issue that I think we need to think about in terms of materiality and the difference between seeing something and experiencing something.
We have time, I think, for one more question.
Yeah. I'll try and keep it very short. I'm interested in how these talks came together in, well, look, to me, it has something to do with politics, and I think it also has something to do with the notion of who gets credited, but it's about the patronage of reproduction. And I wondered if maybe you would want to just talk a little bit about the notion of patronage through analog and into digital reproduction. And we keep sort of touching on it very gently, but it might be interesting to hear what you all have to say on that. Or not.
Well, I would say in the case of Sterling Maxwell, I do think that he is quite careful about, who credit should go to. But he does say very clearly at the start of and this is quite interesting that, it's probably the annals of the artists of Spain, that those Tolba-type illustrations, for photographic historians, they're probably thinking, oh, these are examples of Henneman. And for art historians, they're examples of Sterling. But Sterling does say in his preface, they were photographed in London under my superintendence. So, you know, and he says that more or less in the first line, and then he goes on to say by Mr. Fox Talbot's able assistant, Nicholas Henneman. So that's kind of like the second line. But actually, things that kind of came out of researching how and where they were photographed and everything, because they're photographed, or for those of you who are interested in all of this, that you know the first photographic establishment was in Reading, outside of London, and then they move into London. Henneman moves his business into London, and it would seem that when the annals were being photographed, that is exactly that transition time. And it's clear from the addresses on the statements of account and some of the letters that Henneman is writing from both places. And then there's a letter which is actually in the online William Henry Fox Talbot correspondence project that Kelly, is why I'm sort of gesturing in this direction, that Kelly worked on. There's a letter where Henneman says, I'm working on these, but the weather hasn't been good, and I'm working on Stirling's paintings, including a large painting, and I'm thinking of taking them up to London to finish them. And, you know, and I'm thinking, well, Stirling says that they're under his superintendence. Does he exactly know about it? And all of these works, you know, including one of the rarest, you know, this incredible Murillo drawing. And those are things that don't even belong to Stirling. Having worked in museums, you know, and the kind of protocols that you have to go through for all of these things, you know, and it's quite fascinating there. So,
really quickly, I think I've got the opposite situation I'm trying to explain in that 1863 volume that William Notman produces, there's 46 photographic copies of works of art by the old and modern masters, and in the table of contents, the painting is titled and credited to the artist. There are 2 photographs from nature that are inserted into the sequence, and they are not credited to William Notman. They are credited in the column that says artist it just says nature. And I think that was an argument that he was embedding in it, that photography can be art, and that the art in the photograph is the work of God. And you can't argue with that one. Big patronage.
I think in terms of life and your question, it's really interesting because life in the captions, and this also is actually going back to the other question too, previously, when they reproduced the works of art by the war artists, the names of the artists are very prominently within the text of the article. That's not always the case when they reproduce photographs. Sometimes if you want to know who took the photograph in Life magazine, you have to go to the column where it lists who did the picture on page 7 or who did the picture on page 18 or whatever. But sometimes they did put the name of the photographer, like George Silk's series on Monte Cassino. They say, George Silk, we sent him to photograph. These are his amazing photographs. So it really depends on the article. But in general, when they reproduced images by painters, they're in their... the other thing that's interesting in terms of the patronage is that Life was really proud of its technological accomplishments in the ability to reproduce, but also to, actually before reproducing, their ability to photograph the art and then reproduce it in color. So for example, when they published the Sistine Chapel issue, they obviously have Michelangelo clearly written, but they also actually have a page that shows Frank Lerner, the Life photographer, photographing the Sistine Chapel. He's so amazing for being able to do this so that we can all see it and enjoy it and hold it in our hands. So it's really a bunch of different levels in terms of Life and its reproductions.
Thank you so much once more. We have now a break for lunch. The second session begins at 2:15. And once more, thank you to you all, the speakers, the public, for this discussion. It was, I think, a great start of our symposium. Thank you.